All right, everybody. Hello and welcome back to In Liberty and Health. Very much so excited for today's show. I've been listening to this guest quite a bit, and him and I have quite a bit of crossover. He's an ex-military guy, also talks a lot about economics and foreign policy, which are two things that are of great interest to me. And he is a former power lifter as well, which is my jam as well. As you can see, I got my Club NBT. There we go. Club NBT hat on for the great gym owners that are just a couple minutes away, Justine and Joel. So very much appreciate them, obviously. But yeah, dollar hegemony in 2025. We're looking at some very, very interesting times going forward. There's a lot going on in the foreign policy aspect, and then obviously with the Federal Reserve and Jerome Powell, and if he's going to, cut or leave rates where they're at, kind of what's up with that, and then kind of how BRICS and all the other nations are kind of going about the dollar throughout the world. So I think it's going to be a very, very valuable and interesting conversation. But before we get into that, make sure you go to all the links below where you can find my guest, everything he's got going on, everything I've got going on. TigerFitness.com/Kyle M to get a little discount whenever you go to Tiger Fitness and shop through them to get all these supplements that make you look all jacked and tan, the stuff that I use every single day. Fox & Sons Coffee, use code Kyle at checkout and deemed fit through the link below to get yourself a little discount and help support first responders as well. Sarah M25 should be the code for that. And without further ado, let's get into today's conversation. Where the heck is it? And welcoming to the show today, Tony Arterburn. How you doing, man?
I'm doing fantastic. I love the intro.
Nice, man. Well, I appreciate it. That was one little cut up out of one of my band's tunes, and then some lifting and some other stuff. I tried to make it look as flashy as possible. My old toolbox is in there, but I do have a new one, so I'll have to update that eventually. But why don't you tell my audience who you are and what you do?
Well, again, thanks for having me, and I look forward to our conversation. I am a veteran of 3 foreign wars. Went to the Army in late '99. Did my 3 tours overseas: Kosovo, Afghanistan, and Iraq. I was a paratrooper military policeman. I learned a lot about history and foreign policy in real time during those tumultuous years. And I got home and started several different businesses along the way. I learned a lot. And I decided around age 38, which was 2018, I was going to go all in on precious metals, gold and silver and coins and other things. Just my reading of history and the timeline that we're on, I believe just subconsciously that there was something terribly wrong with our currency, the dollar, and everything that tracked back to it, the origin of central banking itself. And so I started a company called Wise Wolf Gold and Silver, pretty much in defiance of the norms or what it was prescribed to me as somebody who grew up in the '90s and what the system was. So I decided to do something counter to that, and I believe I was right. I've been on a wild ride through broadcasting and podcasting and my radio show and reaching lots and lots of people. And we have now we're servicing nationwide with Wise Wolf. We have a subscription program, and it's my mission to advise people on what's wrong with fiat currency and the evil in that, and how you can protect yourself against it. So that's pretty much me in a nutshell. I
Yeah,
left
man.
out the
Well,
powerlifting though. I mean, you introduced me as I was a world champion
yeah.
powerlifter, but it seems like a long time. Even though I go to the gym every day and I own a gym, but I don't compete anymore. I might sometimes again, like maybe do a deadlift competition. I did a push pull back in 2023. I did the state championship and I competed as a master and in the masters division and actually won down in Texas a couple of years ago. So.
Oh man, that's all good stuff. Yeah, I think the economic stuff tends to get overlooked because the culture war and then foreign policy tends to be, for most people, a little bit more interesting. Whereas when you're dealing with like objective numbers and kind of how those objective numbers work in the real world, sometimes they can be a little bit dry. But I did find when I was reading, what the hell was it? Yeah. How an Economy Grows and Why It Crashes, which is almost like a kid's book by Peter Schiff. I found that book very, very difficult to put down, but kind of learn about Austrian economics and kind of Austrian economic theory. I think really helps you understand how and why some things happen, and then also you can kind of predict the way that things are going to look somewhat down the road. Now, not obviously with 100% accuracy, because I think a lot of the Austrians tend to be perma bears. Obviously Peter Schiff being one of the big notable perma bears, where the crash is always coming. It's like, well,
Right.
you're right, but putting a date on that is a little bit more difficult. So, what really got you tuned into economics? And do you consider yourself a student of the Austrian school, or kind of what's more your leanings?
Well, I'm definitely not Keynesian. We're inside of a real-time experiment since 1971, and that was August 15th when Richard Nixon took us off the gold standard. Gold was $35 an ounce. It had been set that way since 1944 at the Bretton Woods Conference, which was basically the end of World War II, or the last year of World War II, and that's where they set up the new economic world order, which was the IMF, the World Bank, and they made the dollar the world's reserve currency, and then again $35 an ounce for gold. By 71, we had shown the world that we were debasing our currency. We'd taken the silver out of our coinage starting in 1965 and expanded the money supply. The rest of the world took notice. President de Gaulle of France sent his warships over to pick up their gold, the dollars that were being repatriated. So Nixon closed the gold window basically out of necessity, because we had had this expansive money supply, and if it was all cashed in, we were bankrupt. We wouldn't be able to facilitate the taking of gold, at the window for dollars that were repatriated. I will remind your audience too that it was illegal for you to own gold as a U.S. citizen at that time, and it wasn't until Gerald Ford made it legal in 1974, which is a great day for everybody, because you can become your own bank again and have your own gold standard. But a lot has happened since then. If you're a student of history like myself, and I'm just a student of history, I know some real historians. I actually do shows with them, like Don Jeffries, who wrote Hidden History. So I know real historians. I'm more of an amateur, but I just notice patterns. And if you know that the average lifespan of a currency not backed by anything is about 26 years. So a fiat currency, and the word fiat means by decree, as I'm sure you know. It's just basically they say so. It's the
Mhm.
dollar is worth something because the U.S. government and the central bank says it is. Well, that's all well in theory, and that's what it is. But eventually, on a long enough timeline, paper currency, like the philosopher Voltaire said, always returns to its intrinsic value and state, which is zero, because it's written on paper. So, given what we know about things like the deep state and corruption, and how really we've gone off the rails in the last 50 years, so far away from the founding intent of the United States and what our founding fathers set up, it just seemed natural to me to get into this type of business. I grew up around entrepreneurs like my father. He was
Mhm.
really a a force of nature to watch. He built businesses when I was a kid. I just thought that was normal. Like, you had an idea, you write it down, you have a plan, you go build something. I just thought that's what you do. I didn't realize till years later how difficult that was. There's a magic in it, but it's also very, very difficult. Um, so, I guess it was just really a series of events that led me to what I believe is my calling, which is precious metals and alt media, and taking these complex issues and trying to distill them in a way that, like you mentioned earlier, it gets wonky. A lot
Mhm.
of the time, I think they keep you feeling like you don't understand something, like it's so complex that, oh, well, I guess they know what they're talking about. Like, if you
Yeah.
listen to Jerome Powell, or if you listen to any of these people that are associated with the central bank, or Janet Yellen, who was head of the Fed and then the Treasury Secretary. If you listen to them, and you're like, okay, well, they must know what they're talking about. Well, not really. I mean, Janet Yellen said, I think a couple of weeks ago, that um, well, before she left, before the new administration. So I think that now that I'm looking at it, that the COVID stimulus may have had something to do with the inflation. So that was
Maybe.
Janet Yellen, ladies and gentlemen. Um, Really, they make things complex, so you know think that, well, I'll leave it to an expert. It's really not that hard to understand once you realize they have a counterfeit printing press. They increase the money supply. The dollar doesn't gain value and purchasing power in the long term. It may have some short term strengthening or whatever you can see, on the
Mhm.
dollar index, but on a long enough timeline, it just continues to go down in purchasing power, and that's because they increase the money supply. And that's what you're seeing when you see gold. Like, gold just hit another all-time high, but it's not really doing that. Gold is about the same as it was in value as far as what it trades for, or what it could buy 100 years ago. I mean, it could buy about
Mhm.
the same amount of land and crude oil and groceries and food and commodities that it did 100 years ago within the margin of error. But the dollar is what's losing, and so that's the magic trick that the mainstream doesn't talk about, and certainly isn't taught in schools.
Yeah, for sure. So it's kind of funny when you mentioned going off the gold standard back in 1971, because that's when not just, the distortion of the dollar, but the distortion of a lot of things kind of went all over the place. And, when you start thinking about interest rates and kind of the Austrian insights when it comes to interest rates, um, you think back to 1971. So that was when we had birth control. And then we also, enabled many, 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 many more people to go into debt through extending credit lines to them and all this, and then also you were able to print money ad nauseum, and then that's when we started to get a lot of hyper palatable foods. Because if you start to look at like caloric consumption from back in the like late 60s until now, I mean everything goes up. People are looking for some like specific poison in the food or something like that. It's like, no, it's just the fact that like as a species, we figured out that like, hey, hyper palatable foods that are very calorically dense, it tastes really good. We like those. And if we don't have to fight or kill for them, we like them all the more. And then over time, we work less and less active jobs. And then, like I said, you look at graphs of all the calories we consume. We eat more fat, we eat more protein, we eat more carbohydrates because now we're able to produce all this stuff more. But of course, the lowest of all the macronutrients that we eat more of is protein, which is, in my opinion, the most important macronutrient because that's the one that builds muscle, that's the one that builds bone, that's the one that's going to make you going to contribute to your longevity the most. So, I
Right.
mean, it started distorting everything about our lives all the way back then. And then now, back in the late 90s, we cut interest rates down to almost zero. And then from about 2010 up until 2020 ish, interest rates were at 0%. So you're able to borrow money, same as cash. So you have to imagine, what does that do to a society? Not just, the money, but to a society that thinks that you don't have to delay gratification anymore. I mean, that really changes people's psychology. And I think that's why, this economic stuff is actually a lot more important than people, I think, tend to understand.
Yeah, if you look at the origin to corruption in the United States, the accelerator really gets mashed down when we create the Federal Reserve, and
Mhm.
that's when you get a select group of people that control the money supply. Um, Fiat creates a fake world. It creates businesses that shouldn't exist. It rewards
Mhm.
those who are close to the central bank instead of rewarding those who are creating the best product or the most profitable. If you notice that this isn't your father's stock market or your grandfather or your grandmother's stock market. It has nothing to do with, like, if you look at Wall Street, profit is not really the goal. It's their connections, it's liquidity, it's debt, the ability to borrow. So we're addicted to debt. I mean, was the bankster J.P. Morgan said that gold is money and everything else is credit. Well, that's not true. Not anymore. Gold is money, but everything else is debt. So we created this debt society and fake news, fake wars, fake politicians with real consequences is what I always say. And that really talks about fiat food. I mean, you
Mhm.
mentioned diet. It bleeds into so much because we work more and more to produce less and less because of the
Mhm.
system. When your currency is losing value, it's hard to get ahead. So you have to get to the next product. You have to put it in an IRA or a 401k. You have to get into the system in order to outpace inflation. They don't tell you that, but if you noticed when we went off the gold standard, 1971, by 1974, then you get the first products like IRAs and 401ks. And you start seeing commercials like in advertising get into the zeitgeist where people are saying, well, I should get into the stock market too. This wasn't really part of the American landscape. The American dream was, to own a home and you could save for retirement and all that stuff. But that kind of goes out the window when you can't save your own currency. So, to kind of bleed those things together, you'll see that the when the money isn't real, and you create all these ancillary things that are also fake, they tend to bleed into your food. They bleed
Mhm.
into everything. There's that website WTF happened in 1971, and it talks about the not only the economic consequences of fiat currency, but the social consequences. Um, what it does to families, what it does to society itself. It really is truly demonic when you look at, again, the average person doesn't really see it that way, but if you look at it from a 30,000-foot view and then look at the timelines of the decline of countries or civilizations, it really tracks back to who controls the money supply and do you have sound money and is there trust? Because that's, we have in God we trust on our dollar bills, but
Mhm.
is that true? I mean, do you trust that? Is that your God? I think these are the questions that hang over society at large, and whether it's conscious or unconscious, the consequences are real.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's kind of funny you brought up "In God We Trust" there. I consider myself to be agnostic, but the one thing that I think a lot of atheists and secular people do have to answer for is, okay, well, how do you run a society if you don't have religion? And that's kind of it goes back to the question of, um, you know, or don't tear down a fence unless you understand why it was put up. And I think that's what a lot of people specifically more secular leaning people kind of look at that and think, oh, no, we can evolve past religion. It's like, well, I'm not necessarily so sure we can. And, the next question after that is, are you sure we should? And I mean, that's a loaded question in of itself. I understand the arguments for it, but at the same time, you can look around in our society. And like you said, a lot of this stuff, I couldn't think of a better word to say other than demonic, and how, currency manipulation really manipulates most things in our society.
Yeah, it does. I mean, and this is my wheelhouse, so this is what I see every day when I wake up and I look at headlines. The first thing I start looking at is the prices of commodities, and I look at the financial headlines, and that's going to show you what the geopolitical or political headlines are. They directly correlate, but again, most people don't think to look there. Um, but that's a consequence really of the last 100 plus years. We're really gotten so far away from the intent of the founding fathers and what the United States was set up to be, which is a republic with sound money and free markets and other things that made the country strong in the first place, manufacturing. And we're in this weird political swing where things got so bad that you see people like Trump being elected. I never thought that I ran for Congress, 11 years ago, and talked about tariffs, and they looked at me like, well, the voters didn't, but the establishment and the people I was running with were like, what is he even talking about? Like, this is. I remember a very popular conservative radio host who I was on the station with when I started in radio was like, that's lib stuff that you're talking about, jobs and bringing the jobs back and being against free trade. That sounds like lib stuff. I remember I thinking, well, you really don't know history. And I felt like there was going to be a massive populist revolt based off of just where the numbers were going, and eventually, like when you look at what's happening to the United States, where we're abroad, just not the same entity, bogged down. Look at our border. Look like a pitiful giant. The economy's weakening. The wealth distribution and concentration is the worst it's ever been. Not that there's anything with concentrating wrong with anything concentrating wealth. It's just the disparities gotten out of control. We used to have such a strong middle class. So I see a lot of these things that are happening on the political horizon, and this is a direct correlation to what's wrong with the money. And my problem with politics now that I've, 11 years after I ran for office is that I like to tell people, well, until you fix this one thing over here, you really can't fix the other things. There's a reason why Donald Rumsfeld on September 10th, 2001, and that famous press conference, he says we can't track $2.3 trillion at the Pentagon. And of course, the office where they had the accounting office is where, whatever hit the Pentagon, the next day.
Yeah.
So, you do your own, think for yourself on whatever that means to you. But they couldn't track $2.3 trillion. And I know that sounds like today it's kind of quaint because we go $1 trillion in debt every 90 days. But I would add, there is something terribly wrong um, when, it took us, over 200 years to go $1 trillion in debt. I was born the last part of 1979. I was actually born on the day the Soviets invaded Afghanistan,
Mm.
and the tail end of '79. We weren't quite at $1 trillion in debt then, but now we do it every 90 days. So that's something that's a metric that you can't escape. It's going to continue to grow and grow because the liabilities are so vast, and we've increased the money. We don't even talk about fiscal responsibility anymore. So,
Mm.
um, at that level, I'm not an alarmist. I just say, look, the system is going to have to reset itself. As a matter of fact, they call it a great reset. I'm not an advocate of that. I think
Mm.
it's terrible. I like sovereignty, and I think we ought to make our own decisions. But the banksters worldwide, whether you're talking about Davos or the World Economic Forum, all that stuff, they're looking at a reset to protect themselves. And they know that the system is unsustainable. That's the word that I would use, unsustainable. Um, so all that's going to come to a head, I think, really within this decade. And those who have commodities and understand what money is, as opposed to what currency is, are going to be a lot better off.
Right, right. I agree. And this kind of gets into another part of the conversation I wanted to have specifically with you today is one of my how do I want to say this? Like one of my more focused topics is like geopolitics surrounding China because obviously anybody who's really paid attention to like more of the national defense strategy and kind of the way that a lot of the foreign policy has shifted over the last 10 years is mainly focused at fighting great power competition instead of doing terror wars, which I mean obviously we're still doing all the terror well most of the terror wars with the exception of one now. But basically the national defense strategies ever since 2011 with Hillary Clinton had laid out, well, now we want to pick a fight with China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea, which, like, it's ridiculous. But the one thing I say a lot now is that China has now become a lot like what the US used to be, where now their middle class is getting very, very strong. Their purchasing power is going really far. They have a manufacturing base. Vehicles for them are super cheap to purchase. Now, granted, I mean, they're still very, very sick, a very, very poor society overall, but I mean, their standard of living and their GDP year by year by year is still going up at exponentially a higher rate than the US, where I think the US GDP grows by like, you would probably know better than me, but by around probably 2% per year. China was there for, anywhere from like 10 to 15% there for, I think, about a decade. And then more recently, it slowed down to about like 5 or 6%. Granted, once again, still lots of issues, but once again, they took a note from our book and said, hey, we're going to become a manufacturing base. And yeah, you could say cheap Chinese crap, but over time it's gotten better and better and better. Whereas we produce nothing over here and, we consume lots. And, much to your point, basically now we send out worthless paper everywhere that's just rapidly losing purchasing power. And we're getting all this stuff from them. So, what is your opinion on kind of like the whole BRICS nations? Now, granted, there's no like one currency for BRICS, but kind of like what their overall economic value is versus kind of like the dollar and NATO. So I know it's a very expansive topic, so take as much time as you need.
Well, I think the BRICS is a response to U.S. dollar hegemonic dominance gone awry, and we have 40 different sanctions on 36 different countries. Last time I checked, we weaponized the dollar, and instead of making it easy and safe and having the trust built into the system, we used it as a weapon because we didn't see anything on the horizon that would supplant our dominance, and that's very arrogant. You can see, the CIA has a term for that. It's called blowback, and that's what BRICS is: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa. And now they, are adding Saudi Arabia and Iran, and even countries like Mexico. There's like 25 different countries in the periphery that are going to be joining BRICS. I don't think they're going to create a competing currency. I think what they're doing is they're trying to create cross-border payment systems that they can use commodities like gold. I've said recently, I think gold has already supplanted the dollar now as the world's reserve currency. It's just that you don't see that way. I think these other countries do. I'll give you an example. In 2021, the Bank of International Settlements gave gold the designation of Tier 1 status and designation instead of Tier 3. So that put it on par with currency. And so at that time, I think gold was way down the list for central bank holdings and reserves. Now it's number 2, the dollar being number 1, and it just surpassed the euro not too long ago. So I think gold really already is, again, the world's reserve currency. You just don't see it that way because it's not quite set up to where it can be cross-bordered the way that I think BRICS would like outside of the U.S. system. But that's coming. And you mentioned China. Well, yeah, they took our old playbook. I mean, it worked great. We're the manufacturing marvel of mankind, and we did that because we had tariffs and economic nationalism, and we were strategic, and we built things. There's a huge difference between being a productive nation and a consumptive nation. And I think, the metrics for wealth are really on the side of those who produce and can produce. And China, I mean, we gave them the playbook, we gave them resources. Most of my study leads to me to see that all this is on purpose. If you look at the pawning of America's soul, to quote Pat Buchanan, he wrote a great book back in the 90s called The Great Betrayal, and I read that as a younger man, about economic nationalism, what tariffs were, what these free trade agreements were all about, the siphoning off of wealth, and jobs and technology from the United States. We just gave China stuff. I mean, you look 90 days after 9/11 to the day, it was December 11th, 2001, we gave China most favored trading status for the World Trade Organization. And after that, we lost 55,000 factories. 1 in 3 manufacturing jobs disappeared. I mean, it was just a total gutting of what was left of the manufacturing base in the United States. And so you can't really blame China. A lot of people right now that's like China's the enemy. I'm like, well, okay, well maybe so, but who are the people making the calls? They're inside the house is really just putting us on a track for poverty. So I see it as a systematic weakening of what the country was intended to be. And I think ultimately China will slow down. I mean, you were talking about the GDP growth and economic growth that they had. I don't think they can sustain those numbers
Right.
over the long haul. And they have like cities that are built out, and they have a real estate crisis. They have a currency
Mhm.
crisis because they have fiat currency. But the one thing about China that's not talked about in the mainstream, and that I really do believe from my research, is they have more gold than the United States of America. They started buying off the books at the beginning of the century. They have 60,000 gold mines. They're a net importer, not exporter of gold. I really do believe that they are. This is where I think it's all headed: is that commodities and rare earth minerals, and those who control that will control the economic foothold, for the world itself in the future. And the United States is lagging way behind. Now, whether or not, you know, we're definitely on a completely different track than we were 90 days ago. I will
Right.
say that the second Trump administration doesn't look like the first one, which is surprising. So there may be a lot of economic shifts that I wasn't even expecting. But again, you know, the price of gold today breaking all-time highs again. And the reason is because of the threat of tariffs. I like tariffs. They can be great. They can also backfire on you real bad. It's a double-edged sword. So what you're seeing right now is like the rise of gold and silver prices, and that's not. I don't think that's surprising given the uncertainty and the nature of where we're headed as far as what role the United States is going to play economically worldwide when these countries have already decided. You got to look at BRICS as 40% of the world's population and growing. I mean, they're adding new countries. They don't want the U.S. system. So de-dollarization is not a conspiracy theory. Literally, it's happening in real time.
Mhm.
And I would also add, if you're not staying in, I mean, if you're not like me and just like every day looking at headlines, we lost the petrodollar. I find that to be fascinating. Like we literally lost it. We had a 50-year agreement with the Saudis to denominate crude oil exclusively in dollars. And that's what we backed our dollar with. And it used to be a conspiracy. Oh, there's no such thing as the petrodollar, and that's not why we go abroad. So you were called that if you were like, hey, this is we're going over the Middle East because we have to prop up the petrodollar, or we're going to kill Gaddafi because we're going to prop up the petrodollar. And people, oh, that's so
Mhm.
conspiracy. It's not. And we lost it. So what does that mean? And we didn't even put up a fight. We didn't even say, let's have a summit or what kind of deal can we do? They just let it lapse. So that was a huge signal to me that something is not right at all. Like we're not even trying to prop up the current system. So um, what that means for the horizon, I don't know. But I do know that gold and silver and Bitcoin, but the precious metals that that you can hold in your hand, that's going to be, I think, more and more looked at by everyday people outside of the current financial system. I think it'll gain in popularity more than people think here in the next 5 years.
Yeah, yeah, and I think that's a very, very positive development when it comes to, kind of moving more currency towards the, metals, and I do agree with the point about China probably is gonna start to slow down, and, I hear a lot of people talk about their, population collapse. We'll see. I think there are some signs that point to that, but, it's so hard to know because the world's so unpredictable at this point. But one other thing that you kinda mentioned there briefly was Bitcoin. So, obviously, the explosion of crypto over the last like 20 years, perhaps very much so over the last like 5 years, um, is interesting to say the least. I'm not a Bitcoin believer. I mean, I've interviewed some bigger Bitcoin names and, I'm friends with some people in that realm. I'm not a whole hog buyer in crypto. I think it's an asset, and I think Bitcoin's utility, at least from my perspective, is more so the network that's surrounding it, not necessarily the coin itself. But how do you kind of see crypto in the current world? Maybe starting with Bitcoin versus heavy metals, and even if there is like necessarily any kind of conflict there, and kind of maybe some stuff with like NFTs and meme coins, and where you kind of see all this going.
Well, the NFT and meme coins, you can put that in a separate category. I
Sure.
think that the rise and popularity of crypto is a good thing. You can hang a question mark over some of the other technology based on that or based off the popularity. Meme coins can be very dangerous. I don't you can make some money, but I don't ever advocate them. I'm a Bitcoin maximalist when it comes to crypto. As a matter of fact, my company, we started a separate entity to deal in Bitcoin, Wisewell Bitcoin. We've been in the space since 2016. We're actually one of the oldest, if not the oldest, broker in North Texas. We were some of the first Bitcoin ATMs there in my home state, and I learned a lot about Bitcoin. And I would say the decentralized network, the story of Bitcoin makes it unique in the realm of cryptocurrency. Not that other cryptocurrencies aren't valuable or there's not, a huge upside. And I'm not saying any of that, but I'm sticking with Bitcoin because I think there's something on the horizon with nation states using it because it's not associated with a company, because it's not associated with a nation state. That there's an opportunity there where Bitcoiners will talk about game theory, where the countries and central banks will put it on their balance sheet because it is finite, because you can't make more of them, because you can't increase the supply. It's impossible. It's based on the network itself. And so a lot of these entities, I believe, will start putting on their balance sheet. And even Larry Fink from BlackRock said at Davos, he predicted a $700,000 Bitcoin price. He's never done that before. Not that I follow Larry Fink or care what Larry Fink says necessarily, but I think that's something you gather, like if you're just reading the grand chessboard and looking at intelligence. If you take $700,000 Bitcoin at face value, then that means it's on parity and has the market cap of gold. So I
Mm.
thought that was an interesting overture that he made. So I'm watching that very closely. I think these things can go together. A lot of Bitcoiners will say that Bitcoin will demonetize gold and silver. I don't agree with that. I don't even
Mhm.
think that's even close to the mark. Gold and silver do something that Bitcoin can't do, and that's exist in the third dimension. They exist. I can hold them in my hand, and I think everybody, and that's the difference. That and that precious metals do something that Bitcoin doesn't do. Also, they're culturally on demand for jewelry, things like that. We use them for dental. We use them for medicine. We use them for technology.
Yeah, I hate to
Um,
interrupt you. So I apologize, but I just want to add on there while you were mentioning the use of gold and silver. I'm an automotive mechanic by trade, and crash sensors, right? Something that has to respond very fast. So it's basically a diaphragm, and whenever the vehicle experiences like a collision, that gold inside that crash sensor, because gold is the most conductive metal, it's very necessary to have something like that that can respond and conduct electricity very fast for safety of people. So just much to your point, and just something I wanted to make
no,
sure
you're
was in there.
absolutely right. So, I mean,
Mhm.
there's, the monetary uses for gold are certainly there, but I mean, I read a lot about gold and history and humanity. It's so much a part of our existence, of our story as people. So that's not going away. But I do believe that Bitcoin has a huge role to play. Um, and no one can predict the future. But we live in a fiat world, and the fiat system, especially since 1971, all other countries followed suit and removed their currencies from the gold and silver standard. Switzerland being the last one in 2002. So there's 52 times more currency on Earth today than when I was born. So
Mm.
that's an increase in the money supply. And when you do that, you decrease the purchasing power and value of it. Um, that's just mathematics. And I'm not an expert. I can't pretend to show you on metrics of why that, how far the fiat's going to go as far as, low in purchasing value. But it's going to continue. And gold and silver are just a hedge against that. You look at, I have like 5 different websites for my companies, and I have 2 different physical gold and silver locations, and then I have my nationwide business. We never use the word investment anywhere because I don't
Mm.
really. I'm not an investment advisor. I don't put you in investments. But if you go out today and you earn fiat dollars, and you want to have a savings account, well, a great way to do that is to house it in something that is money. You want to take something that's currency and turn it into something that's money. Now, currency and money can be the same thing, but money in and of itself has to do what I just described. It has to have some or other form of value in and of itself
Mm.
to be classified as money. It can't just be, the dollar's not money. It used to be, but the dollar is currency. It can flow like that, and like an electric current. If it stops, it dies. And so you have to really watch that. Once you once you start to notice that, then you'll never look at it the same. You're like, okay, well, I got it. Just like a game of musical chairs, I have to, make sure that I'm not holding the bag when the music stops. So,
Mm.
like, you want to take your earnings, your energy, and house it into something that is finite. And whether that's Bitcoin or gold or silver, I think that's really the future. You look at this decade, and we're inside the Great Reset decade, where so much has gone on. I mean, you can just go back to 2020, at the beginning of 2020, and our lives are completely different. The economy worldwide is different. Businesses, everything, the birth of AI, all of this stuff. It really is going to change the nature of how we look at economics. And I think that the debt explosion worldwide, I think this will have another cascading effect. And that's why more and more you'll see these countries, in every country on earth, would, in order to solve their problems, they have to increase the money supply.
Mm.
That's the trick that they have. I mean, they press the button and they expand it. Um, so you're a lot better off if you realize that right now metals are cheap compared to what the actual debt is, or what the actual debasement of currency is. The true metrics aren't in there. Michael Saylor did a great job in Nashville at the Bitcoin conference by putting up a chart of all the debt, or not the debt, but the assets worldwide in boxes, like these giant
Mhm.
boxes. It's this huge chart. I love this presentation that he did. And up in the top left hand corner, these little dots were the market cap of silver, and at 1.4 trillion, and then gold at 16.7, and then Bitcoin at 1.3 or whatever it was at the time. And I remember thinking, wow, that's crazy. You look at hundreds of trillions over here in these boxes, which are like stocks, sovereign wealth funds, currency, and a lot of it isn't real. So
Mhm.
there's really not enough real to house all the fake. That's what I took away from it. So I think I'm in the right business, and I think people that understand that will be a lot better off. And I think that's why you see BlackRock taking the Bitcoin ETF and running with
Mhm.
it as of January 24. I remember telling my audience at the beginning of 24, I was just like, hey, take a look at what they're doing with these ETFs. The price of Bitcoin is about to go somewhere. And it did. It doubled within 60 days or so, and then continued to do what it's doing. Now we're over, $100,000 Bitcoin. And I think that's really just the beginning, um, because uh, the answer to a lot of their ills are going to try to find something that can stop the bleeding of what fiat currency has done, and that's continue to lose purchasing power.
Right. So, kind of to that point, it seems like the Trump admin, and I definitely agree with you that it seems like Trump 2.0 is a lot different than Trump 1.0, where leading up to Trump's reelection, I was very, very, very critical, and I didn't vote this election because a lot of the signs on the campaign trail, I'm like, it doesn't look like there's going to be any good to come of either one of these options. And I'm glad to say I was wrong in that respect, because a lot of the executive orders are things that I think people of our persuasion would at least somewhat agree with. But that being said, it does seem kind of like Trump is kind of, I don't want to say concerned, but kind of dipping his toe in the water of the crypto world. And I think that's largely because of some of the people who backed him. So the PayPal mafia guys, your David Sachs, Mark Andreessen, Elon Musk, these kind of guys are kind of getting in his ear and saying like, hey, they're talking about that sovereign wealth fund, and who's it? Mark Andreessen is
Right.
the crypto czar and stuff like that. What are your thoughts surrounding that and kind of like the government's interest in crypto?
Well, it's certainly come a long way. I remember when I started buying Bitcoin for my machines at, $400 a coin. It was you were pretty much a pariah. Like, what are you doing this weird experimental thing? It needs to be more regulation. We got to stop Bitcoin. There was a war on crypto for a long time. And then it just kind of goes to this phase where you have presidential candidates like RFK Jr. and then Trump at the Nashville conference, and I remember thinking, this is insane. The amount, just the journey that this technology's been on. I think there's an opportunity there for the upper echelon to enrich themselves. That's true. Bitcoin offers that to everybody, not just the lower strata. It's everybody. I mean, if they get behind it, now it does threaten the fiat order. So I just hang a question mark on that. Are they trying to hijack it? Do they want to implode it? I still think regardless of the executive orders that Trump's put out or statements, you still have to be very careful of the central bank digital currencies. You got to remember it was Jared Kushner that worked, his son-in-law that pushed the CBDC in the first Trump
Mhm.
administration and was working on the blueprint for that. Biden did an executive order when he took office instructing departments to come up with a plan to implement CBDC. So I'm still looking, even with the rhetoric and even with the executive, I'm still looking at that. I don't,
Mhm.
I'm not going to relax my posture on CBDC. But I do think that Trump could do something with crypto. He obviously launched that meme coin before, right? I think day one of taking office.
Mhm.
Um, he's a lot. I mean, this is night and day to what the previous administration was totally anti-crypto and
Mhm.
hostile, really, to it. So we shall see. I try not to, because the water's so murky. You got to stick with fundamentals. But like again, try not to be too speculative because that can get you in real trouble. Like what are the big guys going to do? What's the next move? I just know this. Um, Politically, we don't talk about fiscal restraint anymore. Trump needs a weaker dollar to implement his economic nationalism if he's going to do that, if he's going to put tariffs up, if he's going to try to restart American manufacturing, because we have to build it, and then
Mhm.
our goods have to be able to be exported. So you need a weak dollar. Um, that's going to drive up the prices of metals. Um, you know, the countries that want to repatriate, and there are repatriating precious metals to the United States right now because of the threat of tariffs. It's upending all of the paper markets worldwide. It's really interesting to watch, because a lot of us in the precious metals industry don't believe the current price structure. We think that there's a lot of just papering over supply, and I think if there wasn't the paper and the contracts, and you had to actually show your hand, that prices would go up even further. So there's a huge question mark over a lot of it. I just know that at the end of the day, what I tell my audience is that stick with the fundamentals. We know that we live in a fiat world with fake dollars, fake currencies. So deal in what is real, and what's tangible, and what is finite. And right now, it's gold, silver, Bitcoin for me. And I think that's those three things, in tandem, I think are a good hedge against the Great Reset decade.
Yeah, I think that's sound advice. So one other thing I wanted to get your perspective on, because a lot of the people kind of like the more dissident right sphere. So maybe like the first name that comes to mind would be like Tom Luongo, who I've had some interactions with on Twitter, but he's kind of a proponent of, and it sounds like a pretty sound theory, but like that Jerome Powell is this American patriot who is trying to basically say, in so many words, fuck the EU. And I think it was in the first Trump administration where they basically got the dollar really separated from the euro, and are now trying to do everything they can by maintaining interest rates where they're at to cut the euro off at the knees. Um, that's kind of a rough idea of what they're kind of talking about, and from my understanding, it does seem like the euro is kind of going down the shitter. So, what's your perspective on kind of this whole U.S. euro? Jerome Powell kind of having rates where they're at. What do you kind of think of that whole situation?
I just saw that the European Central Bank, they're cutting rates. They have to increase their money supply. Their economy is not doing well. They have a demographic problem in Europe. They have a dying native-born population. There's not a lot of energy there, and I think there's going to be a lot of more calls for nationalism inside those regions and countries. I think that's the order of the day.
Mhm.
Um, it's something called ethno-nationalism, which is a phenomenon of history that I don't think that the planners can escape. As a matter of fact, the trend of history right now is going against the New World Order. It's going against centralization. As a matter of fact, we're decentralizing ever since the Protestant Reformation with the American
Mhm.
Revolution and so on and so forth, and technology. But they try to, bend the river of time with either, false flags or wars or whatever, and try and draconian measures to get us to all in one centralized system. But people, humanity itself is trending away from it. So, I wouldn't be betting on these entities like the eurozone or anything like that. I mean, and it might be just WWE with Jerome Powell, because who does he work for? This is
Mhm.
the same people, the people that own the central banks in Europe and the Bank of England that's owned the Federal Reserve are the same folks. So it's probably maybe some infighting or who controls what. But that's beside the point. I think it's 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 all like the old maxims, like back in the medieval times. It was like what how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, and like that's kind of a ridiculous question, like what does that even mean? How do you quantify that? I think that's what we're looking at in our current economic reality, where there's not a
Mhm.
lot of real actual wealth. We're looking to central banks to define economic health or where we are or growth, and that is they're the last entity. They should only be housing sound money. That they
Mhm.
should only be the repositories of our money supply, and not the arbiters of what the economy does, and so or how well the economy is doing. So I think you're going to see a lot more uh, decentralized things like the rise of cryptocurrency. Um, I think you'll see more populist movements worldwide to have a sound economic system. You look at what people are doing in places like India and China. They're buying gold. They're buying because that's where their wealth is. That's what they see it as wealth, and there's something in human nature that does that, from my reading of history. So I think we're just that old Chinese curse. May you live in interesting times. It's hard to know exactly where we're headed, but like I said, you keep going back to the fundamentals. Like, we know that this won't last. Like, whatever economic system we're in, because it's not based on anything real. It's just an illusion. And we have to deal and work inside that illusion, but don't fool yourself.
To the point of everything being an illusion, one thing that I find myself frustrated with whenever I hear people talking about economics, they always cite the stock market as a proxy for the health of an economy. And it's like, okay, well, or I would always see these copy pasted statuses of people bragging about how great the economy was under Trump. They're like, well, interest rates were much lower. Like, well, how do you think that kind of got to us? How do you think that kind of worked out for us in the long run? Clearly not very good. And then of course they never say, oh well, the stock market hit record highs under Biden too. Does that mean the economy was doing good? No.
Well, Venezuela had a massive stock market rally while their currency was dying. I
Yeah.
often point to that. It's like, it's the best of times, it's the worst of times, and you have like a record highs on the market, but I'm cutting up old pieces of jewelry to trade at the local vendor, so there can be some gold. You can have look at the wealth disparity, and that's what you have to look at with the United States. I mean, yeah, Wall Street can be doing really well, but Main Street's not. Um, since 1973, we haven't ran a trade surplus in this country. That's how we built the United States, was trade. And you mentioned China earlier, and I forgot to include, if you look at the amount of trade deficits that we ran, that money has to go somewhere. It doesn't go into the ether. It's like, okay, we brought in, 600 billion more than we exported. Okay, where's the 600 billion go? Well, it goes somewhere else. That's wealth to somebody else, and that's mostly places like China and the Asian sector, and wherever these companies moved after NAFTA, like Mexico and other places, or some oligarch somewhere. It doesn't go to us, the American people, and certainly there's just this huge disparity that's happened. So, again, when you look at all the metrics and all the things that we've lost, uh, purchasing power, manufacturing, all of that, you add it up and you realize that, politically, I don't think it's hard for people to articulate that. It's like, well, I know we lost something. What was it that we lost? We used to be something that, different, totally different than we are today. There's going to be a renaissance, I think, especially in the West in general, and you're going to start seeing, people wanting to return to something more normal. Like, okay, I want to be able to have a living wage job. I want to be able to do that. I want to be able to support a family. I want to be able to own a home. And the problem with owning a home now is an entire generation gets priced out because of inflation. It's caused that, $50,000 house to be worth 500,000. Like, how do you even get into that when wages haven't increased? So all of that really goes back to not having a real dollar and
Yeah,
not
I
having the
agree.
stability of that.
Of course, yeah, and I was kind of talking to some friends on Twitter about kind of like the economic stuff, and you know, I feel for the people younger than me. So I just turned 30 back in November, and I've owned my house in April. It'll be 8 years that I've been paying my mortgage, and thank God, Southwestern Pennsylvania real estate's dirt cheap here. So I mean, I got a pretty nice house for less than $100,000. I'm looking at kids that are 10 years younger than me, and I got all the sympathy in the world for them because it's like you guys are going to have it tough. Like I think you guys are going to pull through because I believe in, the younger generation and their, desire to do well. I know it's popular to shit on the younger generations, but I think there's going to be some if they want it, they'll get it. That being said, it's not going to be easy. For me, it wasn't easy, and for them, it's going to be even harder because, much like we've kind of talked throughout this whole conversation, your dollar goes a lot less further than it, used to. And housing prices are so driven up because, a lot of people do look at their houses as some form of like commodity or something that they can make money on because, oh, I'll reverse, mortgage my house or something like that. I'll take out equity loan or something because, my house appreciated by this much rather than looking at like, no, 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 this is somewhere like I live and something that I need. This isn't like a money making venture. this is, a necessity. And I think, we really lost our way when we started to look at a house as something that we can make money on, without moving out or selling it, right? Like
Right.
that's kind of the way that I think a lot of like boomers started to look at their house. And I think that's kind of why, a lot of people ran up a lot of debt and started to have, all these funky loans out in the economy.
Well, that basically creates giant bubbles, because it's not really worth that. And every time you take out a loan, every time you swipe a credit card, that's currency creation. I know that's hard to wrap your head around, but it's hard for me. It's like, okay, so that's new currency? Yeah, it's new currency. They just create it. Used to, you had something called fractional reserve banking, which, you had so much deposits, and then the banks could legally loan against that, and that's what fractional reserve was. They could loan out, more than what their assets were, or just a fraction of the assets. Now that's off the table. It's literally, we get a home loan, it's new currency. It's new currency enters the system. Eventually, you just have a bubble. And, it's like the Rothschilds said at the beginning of the 19th century, you end up buying when there's blood in the streets. And, they were able to manipulate markets. And that's what a lot of where they got most of their wealth, was through subterfuge and skullduggery and spycraft and other things, like when Wellington defeated Napoleon and they sent their messenger back to sell the stocks rapidly, and they thought that Wellington had lost, and no, they were just wanting everybody to sell and drive the markets to nothing so they can buy it all up. So you have to watch things like that too. Those at the top know, and they're running the simulations, and unfortunately, we don't have the resources to keep up with that. Except you have history, and you can look at history and look at the metrics, and when you know that a fiat system ultimately will collapse on its own weight, there'll be a lot of opportunities too. You just have to stay, as vigilant as you can, getting into the last years of this decade as they go push towards the Great Reset, that you're able to take advantage of that. I think there will be massive bubbles, and maybe we can afford houses again. Unfortunately, a lot of people will get hurt on the way down to some sort of equilibrium. But I just, I can't forecast prices or anything like that. But I think that the true value of precious metals will shine through in the next 5 to 10 years. We're not seeing them now. We're seeing a glimmer of it, but not true valuations. I'll remind your audience that the high for silver, I was just born, it was 1980, and it was $52.50. Um, $52.50 in 1980 is about $300 today in purchasing power, and we've not reached that all time.
Mhm.
We're not nowhere close to that on silver. So there's something terribly wrong with valuations of actual monetary metals based off
Mhm.
currency. And I think that will be something that also corrects itself. JP Morgan Chase is the largest holder of silver in the world,
Mhm.
and they were convicted of suppressing the silver market. A lot
Mhm.
of people don't wrap, they're like, wait, they own the most silver and they wanted the price to go down? Yes.
Mhm.
And they've kept it that way for a while. And, right now, my business is interesting because people are liquidating
Mhm.
and somebody's buying. So, like, a lot of the big purchases I see, actually, I'm buying and I'm selling to the trading floor or wholesalers.
Mhm.
And the business has changed a little bit. People are getting into the markets and other things, but ultimately prices are going up. So someone's buying. Those are institutions, ladies and gentlemen. Those
Mhm.
are countries. They're buying. Russia just made silver, put it on their strategic assets, which is a
Mhm.
huge move. The last country that really held that way was China, and back in the 19th century and early 20th century. So a lot of interesting things on the economic horizon, but change being the one thing that you can count on.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Tony, I want to be respectful of your time, and I thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. So let's please do a follow up. But
Anytime.
until then, why don't you let my audience know and everybody out there in the ether know where they can find you, support you, and all that good stuff.
Well, I appreciate that. And yeah, anytime you'd like to talk again, just, I'd love doing shows and having, this is always a topic that I'm easy to, you can wake me up at 3 a.m. We can talk gold and silver and markets. So it's not a problem for me. You can find my website is my last name dot gold, arterburn.gold. There you'll find my shows and links to my business. My business is Wise Wolf Gold and Silver. And I would add that we did something that really nobody else has. I have a subscription program That, the big gold and silver companies, they don't care that you have $50 or 500 or 5,000. I do. And so I created a subscription program as low as $50 a month. I send you precious metals with a detailed invoice, and we have about 1,400 members all over the country. You can find that on my website. There's a little tab that says Join Wolfpack. And that's what the basis of my national business is, where we ship nationwide. But we also are the first broker in America to accept Bitcoin as cash. So if you've got Bitcoin and you want to buy precious metals, you can buy it from me at no fee. And nobody else does that. So you can go direct through any of my websites for Wise Wolf and or my Arterburn.gold. And I also do some shows. You can check out my podcast, and hopefully you like it. Join it and give me a review.
Absolutely. Well, I highly recommend everybody do that. I know everything I've listened to from mutual friends shows, your appearance on there, and then your own show, I've thoroughly enjoyed. So everybody, make sure you go check out his stuff. And until next time, everybody, thank you so much for listening, and take care. We'll end her there.